without being impudent, can we try and stick to time today?
We're doing well at the moment, Alan.
Good. Keep it up.
We were due to reconvene at 10:45, so we are 10 minutes ahead of schedule, which was good.
Did budget that much time?
We did.
They smell lovely. Yeah, smells amazing.
So, folks, in the interest of this, as this is a workshop, I'm going to chair today and tomorrow. Can I refer you through to this document, which has the timetable and the program set out, and in particular, the document that sits in behind this, which has been drafted as a very concise and useful guide to summarise the plan change and the key issues. It's a very useful document for guiding us through the presentations over the next 2 days. The heavy lifting for the next 2 days is going to fall to Marianne as the lead author of the plan change, and she's got a series of presentations that she will take us all through in terms of the plan from effectively from start to finish. And she will be drawing to your attention the matters that prove to be of some consternation and challenge to the tank group. But we'll provide an overview of the entirety of the plan change over the 2 days. So without any further introduction, I'll hand to Marianne.
Right. Just before Marianne starts, can I just ask that you all have the agenda for the day and sticky notes. The sticky notes are intended to jot down any questions you might have, or will you feel that you need some more information?
Right, all good to go. So the next part of the day and tomorrow, what we're going to do is introduce you to what the plan change is. So to give you the context and the decision making that have led to the draft that you have in front of you. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the non-consensus items because you'll be needing more information in order to support your decision making. So that seemed like just a little bit too much to fit into 2 days. So this day is more concentrating on where the tank group have got in terms of the areas of consensus. So as we mentioned in the report, this plan change expresses the overall decision making by tank, but there are going to be some items of detail that they'll probably look to influence through the Schedule 1 process. But certainly as far as the overall framework goes, this is the tank plan change. So we're going to cover the main issues that the tank spent a lot of time talking about. So over the next 2 days, we'll chunk the discussions up into those topic areas. So looking at how we value water, looking at how contaminant discharges in our ecosystem health can be managed, the influence of climate change on our decision making, water levels, water flows, water allocation. So that's the quantity side of the equation. Looking at water demand, particularly looking into the future and some of the challenges that are facing the community in relation to that topic. There are a number of miscellaneous issues that didn't fit neatly under any other topic, so we'll go over those as well. And finally, and certainly not least important, is around implementation. So how is this plan change going to work? And you know where the area is. It's all of those tank catchments, the Tutaukuri, the Ahuriri, the Ngārororo and the Karamu catchments. And this is a regional freshwater management plan. So we're looking at the sustainable use, development and protection of freshwater resources through this plan change. And just to remind you of the significance of the area that we've got here, we've got some highly valued water bodies that we're managing, rivers, aquifers, lakes, wetlands, and they discharge to highly valued estuaries, the Waitangi and the Ahuriri. We've got a huge area that this tank plan change covers, in excess of 350,000 hectares of land that is subject to the plan change. And most of Hawke's Bay lives in the tank catchments. The 85% of the population live and work either in the cities or in the rural areas. We've got 2 cities and 20 marae that are located in the tank catchments. And of course a huge variety of land uses, from the highly versatile productive irrigated soils on the Heretaunga Plains up onto the pastoral hill country for sheep and beef farming, and further into the hinterland where we've got a lot of dock estate and indigenous forest. So a large proportion of the horticulture is carried out in the Heretaunga Plains and Hawke's Bay, and nearly half of the sheep and beef production. And on top of all of that, the water resources that we're managing enable a huge range of water use activities. So we're talking about the recreation and the other enjoyment people get from being able to connect with water bodies. What the process provided, and as was noted, it was quite a new approach and quite innovative at the time that the council set it in place. But what was behind it was the tank project provided new opportunities. So it enabled a shared understanding about what was important about our water bodies and how we manage them and how we provide for them. It also enabled a much better understanding about the technical complexities, the science around how we manage our resources. We made many scientists, I think, of our tank group. They had to get their heads around some quite complex modelling and information in order to understand what it was they were doing. But as a result of that shared understanding and working together, the opportunity was to produce more enduring solutions, and James alluded to that before. We had collective agreement that things need to be done differently, and a somewhat innovative approach in this plan change that enables that to happen. But it also clearly identified the need for collective responsibility for how we manage our water resources, and that came through very clearly around the commitments by our stakeholder groups, not just in the plan itself, but also in the implementation plan that you'll hear more about later. And the last one was around reducing areas of contest. So as people understand more and agree more, there are fewer things that need to go through the more formal processes of submissions, hearings, potentially environment court. We'll see if all of that came through as we go through the next stages of the tank plan change process. The tank group looked at a whole range of issues and concerns, and don't worry too much about the detail. This was just to illustrate that we were covering a large area and a huge number of issues in relation both to water quality and water quantity, but also in terms of how we manage our ecosystems and make sure that they are healthy. And that poster was the result of the work that the tank did in understanding the complexity of the land uses, the challenges ahead, and the range of solutions that they've come through. And we produced a really neat bit of collateral for some of the public conversations we had throughout the process of the tank work that was really quite illustrative of some of the complexities that were addressed through this process. So first of all, we have to understand, what are we managing the water for? What are our values as a community? What are the things that need to be protected and provided for as we set limits and set our objectives? And there was a lot of work done on this, particularly in the early stages before even I was involved with tank. But a lot of work in understanding the values, and the national framework for decision making directs communities to identify the values that they're managing water for. And through the National Policy Statement for Fresh Water, there are a range of national values that are identified, plus a couple of compulsory values that we do have to provide for. And the two compulsory ones are around ecosystem health and human health for recreation. And in order to understand what we were doing, the tank group and the Mana Whenua group both looked at what are the values that they understood to be important for us to set objectives and limits for. And we ended up with two quite cool diagrams, really, that illustrated the range of the values and also the kinds of attributes or the water quality states that would be used to measure whether or not those values have been provided for. And in particular, we spent a bit of time looking at the iwi and hapu values and interests. As you know, we had a separate Mana Whenua group, or more recently called the Treaty Partners group, that had been involved throughout, and I think the same people sat around that table for a long time to be involved in this whole process. And we looked at identifying values and interests through things like the project around the values and attributes for the Ngāororo and also the Tutaikuri. And there was also a report on the Ahuriri estuary which described cultural values. We also looked at all the relevant iwi and hapu management plans that were relevant to the process and that we had to take into account. There was some innovative work done through the plan change, and we didn't really have a lot of mechanisms or tools by which we could assess the success, I guess, as to whether or not we had properly reflected all the values. And we had Joella join us and did an awful lot of work in developing not just the methodology for the assessment, but actually going through bit by bit the whole plan to work out where iwi values and interests were relevant and whether or not they were reflected properly. So she did that assessment with methodology that hopefully she'll be in a moment to tell you about. We also input resourcing into ensuring that there was a technical review enabled by the Treaty Partner Group so that they could be assured that the right kind of questions were being asked and answered. And I won't speak to that because hopefully Joella will be back in a second to schedule. Oh, yeah, we are a little bit faster. I'll just skip to that, but you might have some questions that have come to mind just in this first section.
Well, I have one. Can you just tell us Joella's role in this, or what
we were conscious that we needed to properly understand the tangata whenua rights and interests as required by the NPS, and Joella had really good knowledge as being part of the one of the Mana Whenua members around the tank table, and she was able to assist in the drafting at a staff level to make sure that we were on track, as it were, and she was contracted by council to provide that additional input.
She was also a critical resource, really, when we contracted Dr. Anthony Cole to do the social and cultural impact assessment. So Joella was essentially adopted by him to do the research that he needed because he's based up in Tauranga, so she was the local person on the ground. And she also set up all the community reference groups and sat through all of those meetings with him, and so she was fairly fundamental in that process too.
Who does she work for?
And here she is.
Who does she work for?
Sorry?
Who does she work for?
Joella, you work for yourself, don't you?
I work for myself.
Right. Good.
Tēnā koe.
I was just explaining that you did a lot of the work for us in making sure that the tangata whenua values were identified and accounted for.
So I met with the tangata whenua reps earlier in the year and shared with you how I developed these tables. The values come out of the Ngāruroro Values to Attributes report, the Tutaikuri Awa Values report, the Ahuriri Values report. Although I did receive it, I note that there was a process when we received the other reports, and the process was that it went before either a hui a hapu or it went through marae committee meetings where it was endorsed, and because of the time limits, I used the Whanganui-a-Rotu report, the Traditional Use and Environmental Change Customary Uses report, what Whaia Joinella sent through. I also used the Ngāti Hori Freshwater Resource Management Plan, Operation Pārtiki, the Tūtai Awa Management and Enhancement Plan. I also used tangata whenua first generation RMA documents, such as the Kahununu Marine and Freshwater Fisheries Kiuta Kitai Strategic Plan, Management Plan for Manaake, that came out of the Tai Whenua and Regional Council resourced that. I also used the Ngāti Kahununu Kaitiaki Monga Taonga Tuku Iho report, as well as a report on the inventory of tank values. I also extracted values from the Hawke's Bay Regional Resource Management Plan and the Hawke's Bay Regional Policy Statement, and those are where the values that sit along the top of the table come from. And what I've done is use those values. I've married them up with the objectives and policies in the tank draft plan that are relative to the issues. And what I tried to do was identify. So the aim of the report was to determine how the cultural values expressed by tangata whenua in the tank plan change process were being translated into the tank draft plan. In order to undertake this assessment, cultural values were developed. The cultural values identified through reports, plans and policies were utilised to develop the cultural values tables. These values are contrasted against the objectives and policies expressed in the tank draft plan to measure how the plan recognises and provides for the relationship of Māori with water, he wai he taonga, and whether the draft plan supports or has implied actions that are consistent with or enhance cultural values.
I think probably what also is important to just say here is that Joella didn't just do this once. She did this for how many iterations of the draft?
I think we're up to iteration 7. So as each
work in progress.
Yeah, as each version came out, I modified my tables to align with them.
Are we able to get a copy of that? I cannot read that there, and I cannot follow what's been said unless I actually have the table in front of me, because it's not in the papers that we've got that I can see.
There's a lot of detail. It will form part of the Section 32 reporting, so it's part of the stack of documents.
If we are expected to understand what has been said today, I think we need to have seen that. We need to see that information in front of us to get an understanding of what you're saying. Otherwise, it's really confusing, because all you do, you're talking to quite a complex table.
We can circulate. Yeah, we can do that today for this level. But this will be a problem that you might face throughout the day, is that there's an awful lot of underlying documentation and complexity with this plan change, and it was a bit hard to know where to pitch the information. I didn't think you wanted the stack of Section 32 reports at this stage, but certainly we can identify where you need the additional material as we go through.
Well, again, the challenge I've got is I'm having trouble understanding what's been meant by the table if I can't read the table.
Really, the detail wasn't as important as knowing the methodology that Joella took at this stage.
I'm having trouble understanding the methodology without seeing the output.
Okay.
And can we have it included in the pack? Because if it's of value to have it in the workshop, it's of value to have it in the pack.
What we're suggesting
Well,
is
they
that
can include it. We've got day 2.
is that inherent in in every presentation you're going to get today, there is an enormous amount of detailed report, analysis, discussion sitting behind, and so part of the way we've structured these workshops and we're hoping for is to introduce the plan at a level that it was not easy to pitch, but then also get the feedback from committee members in terms of what are the information gaps, what are the areas that you do want to drill down into. Otherwise, it's just we could swamp you with paper, or we could give you a 2-pager, and it's just we're going to find out at the end of 2 days, how well or poorly we did in terms of pitching that.
Are we getting it?
Kia ora, Joella. I know you've shown the table, and we've talked about it at a previous tangata whenua reps hui. We'll see the latest version of that, but I assume that incorporates the mana ahuriri, the report that was commissioned by mana ahuriri as well, in terms of the values assessment. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that I didn't include it in the development of these tables. What I did use was the Te Whanganui o Rotu report from earlier, and that was in relation to, why I didn't use it was in relation to the process at which it arrived, and I had the report that Whaia Joinella had sent through.
Can I just to clarify, what's the Te Whanganui o Rotu report that you're referring to?
The why...
Oh, why 55? Okay, yeah. Thank you.
So the shaded area on the objectives column, it talks to the objectives and policy that mana whenua have been reviewing with Marianne, and it talks to the issues that we still haven't resolved. Yeah.
Can we?
And the report goes into a bit more detail as to that.
We still can't see the information by which you're referencing. So it would be good to have that in front of us so that we can at least interact.
Yeah, I think that's not a problem. I have the report here. We just need to bring it down to you.
At the next break.
So I think what I'm hearing you say is that perhaps I don't carry on until you have a copy.
That'd be good.
If you wouldn't mind.
You wouldn't mind, Bex. Sorry, Joella.
That's all questions.
Okay. Come back to that then.
But then we're going to strike this problem throughout the entire 2 days.
Yeah.
We are going to have this problem.
Mr. Chairman, I've got a different view. It's just a personal view. And
Oh, James left. I'm not actually chairing this session, but he's left.
I'd rather see things at the big picture level and concern myself with what is particularly important. It's just my view.
Shall we progress through the presentation and come back to that item?
Yeah.
Okay. So looking at the water quality and some of the challenges around water quality, the main issues that the tank group identified at the higher level were in relation to excessive macrophyte growth in the lowland streams in particular, which decreases ecosystem health, nutrients from the land, which had an impact on algal growth in some freshwater systems, and also impacted on coastal waters. The loss of sediment from land had adverse impacts on freshwater ecosystem health, and also were a stressor in estuary areas where you had increasing rates of accumulation of sediment. Stormwater from urban areas was also a key concern in terms of its impact on ecosystem health, especially in the two estuaries, Waitangi and Ahuriri, and the Clive catchment as well. And the management of our riparian land was also found to be a bit of an issue in terms of the lack of buffer, the lack of ecosystem health, and the lack of biodiversity as well as a further issue, and its role in improving our ecosystems and water quality. Oh, bugger. This presentation uses quite a bit of the information produced by our scientists, and there were some remarkable translations between complex science and the issues that needed to be addressed by the tank group. And one of the scientists, Sandy Heidecker, did some really great work in presenting the information around our water quality and what that meant for the values that were identified. This here, it's not a table that I wanted to show detail of. This was to show how water quality challenges varied across the catchments that we were managing. And the more green and the lighter colours, the better the quality. The darker brown colours indicated where the water quality wasn't meeting objectives for the different values. And this graph here was just to illustrate that the Karamu catchment at the bottom, Karamu and Ahuriri, were the areas where water quality was most often not meeting the needs of the values. So it illustrated that there were different issues in different places across the catchment that needed to be sorted out. And Sandy developed that fairly complex picture into some graphics that helped demonstrate that not everything was the same and that there was no one-size-fits-all kind of solution to the problems in front of tank. And she's coming. And I think it would be better if you heard this story from Sandy. It gives you a rest from my voices for one thing, but Sandy knows the water quality picture in Hawke's Bay in a lot of detail, and her ability to translate some of this complex stuff is amazing. So if you mind.
Just while we're waiting, the graphics are really good to, try and get our heads around it. Are we able to get a copy of this presentation maybe in the break so that we can scribble our bits on it?
That would be
Thanks.
great.
Yeah, we can do that.
A question relating to that, and it might be for Sandy to answer, but the relationship and the connections between each of the rivers as they meet and the impacts of that previous graph, with the orange and the I would like to see the connections of those waterways, because then you can see the I suppose the influence of that graph on the waterways. And I'll ask the questions to Sandy, because like one stream leads into or was leading into another river and so forth, and how far away from that point of red does it have to be before it's a light green? Those are the kinds of questions I'd like to get my head around.
Yeah. There are other maps that you'll see later as well that look at where the values aren't being met in terms of the water quality states that have been assigned. And one of the big challenges is around the cumulative impact of land use and water quality, and it does change as you go down through a catchment as it accumulates. And we're going through faster than we thought. A little bit of ahead of time. So I just explain that one there. I don't know if you want to started on that already?
That is actually, good morning. Sorry,
Morning.
just jumping in here. So that is just a bit of a jigsaw puzzle piece together. It's not looking at the pieces itself, it's highlighting where the issues are and what they are. So at the top we've got the Narurua catchment, middle section is the Tutaikoi catchment, and the bottom is the Karamu and the Ahuriri. And they're the main, or most of the parameters that we measure in our state of the environment monitoring, and they're the ones that are relevant for the values and what we can manage. So if we go for the left, and we just look really at either the color, sometimes it doesn't come out so well, but green means basically all of the samples that we take are within guidelines, are complying with the guidelines. If we go to the other side of the scale, the red or the F means all of the samples that we take are breaching the guidelines and creating a problem. And then we've got this range from green over blue, orange, and red of saying, okay, orange would be half of my values are reaching the guidelines or are complying with the guidelines. So that is just an overview. And we can see that the left-hand side columns with E. coli and toxicity values like nitrate and ammonia, we do not have many issues. We are trying to find where the most issues are or where our priorities would lie. Then we've got chlorophyll A and periphyton, which are these two columns. And the macrophytes, that are our algae and aquatic plant growth. We can see we've got some problems coming up there. Then the DAN, TN, DRP, and TP are our nutrients, and we can see that in the Tutaikoi and Naroro catchments, we've got higher nutrient values in the tributaries and quite high values of quite high concentrations of nutrients in the Karamu. So this is where we can see with the red there is a problem. Then we've got turbidity and clarity, which is an indicator for the sediment coming through. And again, we can see there are some problems in the tributaries, and especially in the Karamu and the Naroro, as well as some in the Karamu catchment. And the MCI is finally the one that integrates all the problems that are our macroinvertebrates, the bugs that live in the streams that kind of react to all the stresses together. And that tells us overall we're really having problems here. And we can see how in the Karamu catchment we've got a real problem with the MCI, telling us that is really an poor ecosystem health. So just, again, going back to the whole picture, we see where most of our issues lie and where they're most severe, and that is in the Karamu catchment. But we do have a couple of things also to do in the Tutaikoi and the Naroro.
I'm intrigued to know why you've lumped Karamu and Ahuriri catchments in the one table and not separated them out.
I only have one site as SOE site, not as targeted sites, but one SOE site is just the typo, that's the very last one. And yes, I could have made another line, but it was kind of squishing it all anyway.
I think
just typo stream is the Ahuriri, that's the last one.
Because what that tells me, where you're saying you've only got one testing spot for the Ahuriri catchment, is that we still don't know enough about it.
No, that's not. This is kind of where we started in the TRANK process. So that is SOE data from so the last SOE report. And since then, Anna Madras-Smith has picked up the Ahuriri as a targeted study, and there's a lot more information out there now. But that wasn't present when I just gathered the information for that discussion. So yes, that was picked up, and we've got a lot of data on just a survey on what's happening in the Ahuriri now, but that wasn't me conducting it, so that's something that Anna can talk about.
Okay, thanks.
Is there a difference between F and P, or do we just forget about those and rely on the colours?
Yeah, that is two different scales. So one is a statistical scale where I say the proportion of my data that is breaching or complying with guidelines, and the last one is the MCI, and that has a 5-class system. So it's really just, and that is called excellent, good, fair, and poor. So it's only 4 classes, and they are actually coded as excellent, whereas the other ones is just really, in case the colors don't come out, I just went from A to F, or I could have gone from 1 to 6. It doesn't really mean anything. It's just a
stick to the colours.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so maybe next slide. So this is what it looks like on a spatial scale. If we look at the catchments, we can see we start with the Naruroro on the left-hand side here, and just taking the data that we had just looked at in the table, we can see that we do have higher concentrations of nutrients in the tributaries of the Naruroro, and also some algal growth going on there. And sediment, not quite as high. Sediment is here as turbidity and clarity, looking at that. And in the main stem, we've got low concentration and low algal growth rates in the Naruroro, but clarity is not quite as good, and turbidity also is higher. If we compare that to the Tutaikuri, we can see that we've got, again, about the same concentrations coming out of the tributaries into the main stem. We've got some algal growth going on there and sediment coming out of the tributaries. And we can see that there is a higher concentration than in the main stem compared to the Naruroro in terms of nutrients, more algal growth or higher algal growth rates, and more sediment as well. Why is that?
And I take it that the Ahuru catchment isn't included in that graphic because there's not enough testing spots.
That's correct. Yes?
I asked the question before you came in the room, but I'm just wondering about, as the streams and tributaries in the Karamu area and Ngararoro, where they meet, I'm just wondering about, the orange to the green, where, if we were to track it along a river.
Yes. Yeah.
How would it look when it meets or links into a main tributary?
Yes, okay, so it is actually, so obvious nutrient concentrations are increasing, algal growth is increasing from upstream to downstream as the tributaries come in and get more nutrients into the main stem. And I'm coming back to that. It all ends up in the estuary, but that's the next step. I would just quickly like to finish on the Karamu. So the Karamu is a different system, and including, and this is not quite showing all the tributaries that belong to that one. So we've got the ones that are more in the lowland sections. They have a lower gradient, quite slower flow, and they tend to accumulate more fine sediment, and they've got macrophyte growth instead of algal growth. So that is another problem that can create lack of oxygen, and is choking the channel and impeding flow. So
Can you just explain what I've forgotten? Had a mind lapse. What's a macrophyte?
Oh, sorry. Yes, no, it's aquatic plants. So they are, instead of algal growth, which are cells together, those are real plants. So they've got roots, they've got stems and leaves. And they grow through the whole channel, so they take up much more volume than algae would just clinging to a stone. So they usually are just at the bottom, and this is why it creates kind of for the whole channel a problem, if that becomes like really a nuisance growth. So for the Karamu, that means because the plants have roots as well, they do not react quite as much on how much nutrients are actually as in concentration in the water. They actually also take nutrients out of the sediment, and you cannot manage them as well through nutrient reduction. You would have to shade them, for example, to take the light from them so they don't grow quite as fast or to nuisance levels.
The redirection of the Ngaruroro, how did it impact? I mean, like you're finding macrophyte and plants and algae now, but I mean, it was a quite different direction when I was a kid, because I lived there. We used to swim in the Ngaruroro, and we used to walk past the Karamu every day. So the redirecting of that river about 30 years ago, that would be reflected in what you see now, would it?
Absolutely. It is now a catchment on its own. Quite interesting.
Because of that?
Yes, because it would have been, before it would have been a lowland tributary to the lower Naruroro main stem.
Yep.
Now that was separated, and it has its own connection to the estuary, and it is a catchment in itself, the Karamu. This is why Obviously, that changed quite a bit. It has got a lot of value now because of its direct connection to the sea for all the species that come in and migrate from the sea directly into that. But the Naroro main stem obviously is, so we've got two separate catchments, and the Karamu is kind of a catchment on its own value now, on its own right. It's not only a tributary anymore.
So all the orange could attribute to the redirection as well as the value gained by connecting directly to the sea. Is that the estuary? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that the main stem obviously has a different character now from the Karamu than it was as a main stem from the Narororo.
I just wonder how much of that's attributed to the amount of red in that area.
To the amount of, sorry?
The red in your graph, you know, because it's a high proportion of red in that, in that table that you had. Green to red.
Yes.
Green to red. So the
yes,
catchment
red,
has
yes.
got a high proportion
Right,
where it doesn't meet the standards.
Yes, it would be one.
Severing it from its main line would attribute to that.
That's right. So one of those columns, the squares, would have been in the main stem of the Karamu, which is not the main stem of the Narororo anymore. All the rest of them, because there were several sites, we've got about 7, 8 sites in the Karamu catchment, and they would still be the same because they just measure what comes into the main stem. So you're one of them, yes.
Question for you.
Yes.
What impact does abstraction of water have on downstream water quality?
I think I'm not qualified to talk about abstraction of water. I'm a surface water quality person. That is something that I would have to
Is someone going to be speaking to us about that later?
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think the short answer is significant.
Significant. Okay.
Correct.
That was our guess.
Okay, so the Karamu has high nutrients, as we saw, coming into the main stem, but our management to solve the problems within the Karamu would be different than just focusing on what is coming in terms of nutrients and sediment. Now, if we go to the next slide, we can see that we've obviously got the receiving environment, which is the estuary. And there we are not interested so much in the concentrations anymore, but in the load. So what is coming as a total into the estuary from the different catchments? So sometimes we may have lower concentration of nutrients, but a lot of flow bringing down altogether then quite a bit of nutrient. And this is why actually the management of nutrients are quite important everywhere in the tributaries of the Narororo, Tutaikuri, as well as the Karamu. The Karamu may not be big, but having high concentration, it is quite relevant for the estuary to manage nutrients there. And also the sediment as a total coming from all the catchments, it's important to look at the load as well, what is actually coming from the different catchments all together into the estuary. And Anna's going to talk about, might maybe talking about what she's done in terms of the estuary. Yes, I think that's about it. Are there any more questions?
Is it on your map, does that go to Pokawa, the Karamu?
Yes, that is.
Oh, that's Pokawa there. And the other one is, so the Karamu affects the Waitangi estuary. Is that what the estuary you're talking about? How does it go?
Yes, they all go, yes, so Tutukuri. And Ahuriri is separate, it's dealt with separately. Yeah. And we've got a lot of research going into that one now. And Karamu, Tutaikuri and Narororo are going together in the Waitangi estuary and have to kind of looked at together in terms of loads what comes into the estuary.
And so, what's the effect of peka peka in terms of its high nutrients? So the nutrients from that Pokawa estuary or Pokawa catchment basically be managed in the estuary, or is it still a big effect?
In the wetlands or in the estuary?
Sorry, when it comes out, until it gets to the mainstream of the Karamu.
So that is something that we have now. We've got upstream and downstream sites where we want to understand the function of the wetlands. So that is, in terms of the science, not quite there yet, that we can actually draw a conclusion on the long term. What is happening?
If we have only one testing point for the Ahuriri catchment, in other words, in the Ahuriri estuary, how confident can we be that the plan is going to be able to reflect what's required if we haven't got the science backing it up?
So that's where we do know some things. So we know certain activities improve ecosystem health, and reducing contaminant losses from land is going to be good for the environment. And so the plan applies to the land and the freshwater that feeds into the estuary. So the provisions that we've got to manage contaminant loss do apply to the land that contributes to the estuary itself. As a general principle, you need to improve the way we manage land in order to improve the estuaries. So that's what the plan is setting up to do as well.
Okay, so that's the land part, but what about the stormwater discharges from Napier City?
We've got a session on stormwater to explain how we're changing the management of stormwater through the plan change later on this morning.
I think there's a general point, Councillor, that this is going to be an adaptive management exercise. There are limits to what's known, and because it's a complex system, drawing simple cause and effect relationships is not necessarily all that straightforward. So what we will be doing through the plan's ongoing implementation and evaluation is looking at whether the management interventions are delivering the outcomes that are sought, and where they're not, they will be changed over time, and that's going to be a general theme across the whole plan change.
Question for you. Excuse my ignorance about estuaries, but are there legacy issues that would need to be addressed in those environments that addressing the inputs into that environment may reduce further build-up, but are there legacy issues in those environments which that wouldn't tackle, if you see what I mean?
Yeah. So the focus in the plan change is to regulate activities that have adverse effects. So that's what we're doing to prevent things getting worse and to improve the state. But there are some legacy issues, particularly in the Ahuriri, which are probably better dealt with through an estuary management plan that enables other actions that also need to be done. And a little bit of that work's already underway with the hotspot work and getting rid of some of that fan worm. So that's not something you can regulate for. It's other actions that might need to be done. A second illustration is the concern around sediment build-up in the Lower Clive Karamu catchment. Again, a lot of that is legacy. The plan sets up a regime to prevent more contaminant or sediment getting into the stream, but there are issues around how the council deals with the legacy part of it, and it's already addressed through previous dredging operations, for example. That's one of the miscellaneous issues we're going to come to at the end of the presentation as well.
Is that in terms of what are the issues that this plan is not dealing with? Yeah, because I think that's an important communication matter. Yeah. One for us to understand, but for the public at large to understand that the plan deals with us. They just want answers to the problems. So, how are we dealing? What other issues are we dealing with in what ways?
Some of those could be highlighted in the implementation plan, but a lot of those legacy type issues are fraught with complexity and also cost. So the council would need to make some decisions about those before you could commit to doing the necessary work.
It seems to me there are two sides to this coin that we're now talking about. On the negative side, there are all sorts of legacy issues that are sitting underneath this plan that the plan itself can't sort of roll back the clock on. And those have been flagged along the way, but in many cases they are. The positive side of the coin is that in many, if not all those cases, there are other activities going on that sit outside the plan that are aimed at mitigating those or trying to remedy the situations. And so I think your point that as important as this plan is, it does sit in a bigger context of everything from tree planting exercises to, riparian programs. There are all sorts of other things happening that support the viability of the plan, basically. And it's a communications challenge at some point in this process to really make that bigger picture clear.
In terms of the legacy issues, given we have lost over 90% of the nation's wetlands, has there been a emphasis within this report to protect our existing wetlands and even maybe grow them?
Well, yes, in a word. The TANT group did have recognised the wide range of values that wetlands have, not just in terms of water quality and quantity, but biodiversity, recreation, managing the impacts of stormwater, for example. And so there is a specific objective that we not only protect and increase the area of the existing wetlands, but a commitment over the term of the plan to create new. So there are specific milestones around areas of wetland to protect and create that the TANT group have considered as a reasonable target within the plan. There are connections, of course, with the biodiversity strategy as well. This plan goes a little bit further than the biodiversity strategy in looking at the creation of new wetlands as well as protecting the existing. Okay, shall we move on? So just in terms of the overall framework for water quality, the TANT group has acknowledged all of the values that need to be provided for, with the environmental values, the ecosystem health as the compulsory value being one of the significant drivers, but also acknowledging the range of social, cultural and economic values that are all also associated with land and water use. And they used a critical value approach for setting water quality states. One of the really clear things that have come through the process with the TANT group is their collective understanding for the need for community responsibility in this space. And it's not just about the council and its rules, it's about finding better ways of achieving our water quality outcomes. And so that's a key feature, I think, both of the plan and of the implementation plan that sits alongside it. And it's reflected by the industry and landowner commitments that we've seen, but also the other stakeholders sitting around the table as well. The other key decision that the group made was that it was best to prioritise some of the effort. A scattergun approach across the whole of the catchment, which is quite large, would probably not get the outcomes that were being sought without a little more attention to, well, where are the priorities, what are the key things that need to be done. And so they identified places and pathways and stresses as well as practices within the framework that we've got here. And the plan also enables an adaptive and responsive kind of approach to how the water quality outcomes that have been identified need to be met. So one of the key messages, I guess, was that people needed to understand what the problem was before they could understand what the mitigation measures were. And we found new problems along the way, which I'll touch on later on. So we needed to allow for flexibility because the plan is not as fast as land use change. It's not as fast as how things change out in the environment. And it was one of the, I suppose, constraints around the plan enabling and improving our water, land and water management. So we needed something that could be responsive, that didn't need to be changed every time something out there changed. So that's what the plan tries to do, is to allow for that innovation, flexibility and adaptive management. So the first thing to do was to work out, well, what were the problems in terms of water quality? What are the targets and limits that we need to set for the different attributes that are relevant to the values that we've assigned to our water bodies? And we've got attribute states for 17 different attributes, and those are in the plan change in tables at, I can't remember what page, in long tables, starting at page 8 of your paperwork. So that the tank group went through a process of saying, well, what are the values for the different reaches of the water bodies that we've identified, and what is the water quality that we need in order to meet those values? One of the early agreements, and quite notable agreements, was that the tank group wanted to maintain. There was no overall decision-making needed here. Whatever the attribute was, it needed to stay as good as it was. If it wasn't at the level at which the attribute state was specified, it would be improved up to that level. So the NPS FM indicates that there might be movement within bands. There was concern that that might lead to a bit of a downward trend within the band. So the group generally agreed that no, that was not something that they wanted to provide for. And the other thing I think that was also quite key was an agreement that all of the attributes were relevant and that it wasn't going to be useful to look at a single attribute in relation to the values. And I guess one of the drivers was the preoccupation with dissolved nutrients. And that kind of preoccupation would not resolve the problems in the Karamu, for instance. As Sandy just said, the dissolved nutrients weren't as big a driver for ecosystem health as the growth of the macrophytes were. So it was important that the group resolved that it was collective management of the attributes that was important. The critical value approach, it didn't mean that the value was the most important. It was the value that was most sensitive to the water quality state. So it was setting the bar at the most needy value, as it were. And we also, or the group, decided that we needed to be practical and pragmatic and do what we could within the plan change timeframes, but also aspire to something better. So there was a two-stage approach that has been developed, that we've got some areas where we need to do some work as a priority in order to meet our objectives, but we didn't stop at that level. We needed to look further ahead and make sure that we had a continuing improvement kind of philosophy built into the plan. That all okay so far?
It would be helpful just to have a little example from the table of attributes versus values. I'm just trying to get my head around.
A simple one, yeah, a simple one was the bacteria levels. They provide for clean water for stock, for example, and also for immersion and swimming. So the immersion and the swimming value were the most sensitive to the number of pathogens. So that would drive the setting of the attribute state. Do you want to, have you got another example that you could use?
Water clarity, for example, you've got, if you have the value trout fishery, that would be quite high water clarity that you'd need, and that provides obviously as well for the recreational water clarity that would be not quite such a high standard, but by setting the attribute at the trout value, you are also providing for the recreational.
Everything else. So the value is the trout fishery, and the attribute is that clarity or other?
Yes, for example, the clarity, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And so all of that work led to the creation of some management units that reflect the reflect the ecosystem characteristics of the different parts of the catchment. And they're built on the Freshwater Ecosystems of New Zealand database, so similar with similar.
That relates a bit back to what I was just really touching on in terms of the aquatic plants in the Karamu catchment as opposed to algal growth. So the natural setting of being in the hill country and faster flows and coarser gravel obviously has another set of animals and plants that naturally live in there under natural conditions. So the whole complex ecosystem works in a different way, and you've got different problems and different ways to manage it. This is why we try to look at types of streams that are similar to say, okay, this is the set of problems that we have there, and this is how we manage it. And that has been done, that's called the FENS system, Freshwater Environment New Zealand. That is for whole New Zealand. but that is fairly coarse because there is a limited set of data behind that. And we've done another exercise where we tested more sites within Hawke's Bay, and we had someone from Cawthron doing at a finer scale the grouping of similar stream types, and this is what comes out of here. So we've got the tributaries of Tutaikuri and Narrow being obviously quite similar in terms of what they need and in terms of their ecosystem functioning. And the Karamu, and this is all of a sudden not limited to the Karamu now, because we've got other lowland tributaries that have the same characteristics as the Karamu, and that is the Waitio, the Tutaikuri, Waimate, and some of the tributaries in the Aoriri. So we do expect another natural system there, and we have to take that into account if we try to set guidelines or look at what we can achieve for that natural system. So according to these natural characteristics or settings, we adapt our management, and this is why the Karamu looks at nutrients and at the macroinvertebrates, for example, in a different way than in tributaries further up in the hill country.
Right. And that's where we thought we would stop and make sure that you were up to understood the general framework that we're looking at, and the next session is looking at some of the detailed management provisions that we are going to introduce to you in relation to meeting the objectives that are set at this point. Okay.
They will explain the densities of the red and the green in the next session.
Not so much explain, but say how we're going to fix them.
Mitigate or manage.
How are we going to get them up to the green? Yeah.
That'd be interesting. That'll be interesting.
Just out of interest, Sandy, you've mentioned that at the time you assembled that graph before, you only had one monitoring point in the Ahariri. How many monitoring points have you got in the other catchments? And are you satisfied that they're sufficient to give you the data that this plan's based on?
It's a bit hard for me to answer because there is a different set for the SOE sites. So we've got more than 70 SOE sites across Hawke's Bay, and they're the long-term sites where we measure state of the environment, and we want to keep them over decades going so we can see trends. For something like plan change, we pick up sites and say, well, we have gaps of information here. We pick it up as soon as we can, and we just gather data for a couple of years. So I think we had an SOE set for the Narororo that maybe about 6 sites, and we took in some other tributaries to gain, like the Poporangi that wasn't on there, the Taruarau was something that we picked up just for the plan change. The Karamu is 7 sites, and the Tutaikuri also around 6 regular SOE sites plus targeted studies or gap sites. So I would really have to get back into my books to see the exact number, which one was which, but that's from top of my head. So we've got each of the catchments, we've got about... Yes, exactly. The Aoriri is always a problem because it's mainly an estuary anyway, so it's got some tributaries that are similar to what the Karamu is, but it's mainly an estuary, so it's not really the typical freshwater. We don't have so much freshwater sites to measure there because it is mainly the estuary, so it's a totally different environment that we measure in another context for estuaries. So this is why it's Anna's resort and not mine.
Can I just clarify that then? Is the estuarine environment included as part of this plan change?
Yes.
Well,
there will be rules, etc., relating to the estuarine environment?
it's related to the freshwater inputs into the estuary. So it's not an estuary management plan as such.
Is what you were saying before, yeah.
So it's making sure that when we set limits and objectives for the freshwater systems, we take into account the impact of those on the estuary. So things like the nitrogen load, that was relevant to the estuary, the health of the estuary, whereas concentrations were more relevant to the state of the freshwater system that they're in. So we have looked at impacts on the estuary. Okay. So in relation to the priority management approach, we looked at where the catchments weren't meeting the objectives in relation to a number of key stresses or thresholds and assigned priority. So the ones that were furthest away from the desired outcomes would be a high priority, medium, low and long term. So we've divided the tank catchments up according to a number of key stresses. So that means things like sediment, how much of a sediment loss risk is there in the catchment, and we would target those high-risk catchments, not just in relation to the loss of sediment itself, the sediment yield that is generated through the SEDNet model, but looking at where there were sensitive receiving environments. So we know that sediment is a stressor for the estuaries. If we were just looking at sediment loss, you might set your target to something like 1,000 tonnes per square kilometre per year as a yield. But because both the tank catchment isn't what you'd call one of the high-risk areas across Hawke's Bay for sediment loss, the Wairoa catchment is truckloads worse. So if you look at the SEDNet model to look at sediment loss risk across all of Hawke's Bay, tank doesn't feature very highly. But we know that the sediment loss being lost from some of the catchments in our tank catchments are impacting on the estuary. So sediment is still a problem, but just in a different way than what you're looking at perhaps in Wairoa or the coastal catchments further south. We've also looked at dissolved oxygen, and that's a key stressor in the Karamu catchments, as Sandy was explaining, that the impact of all of those macroinvertebrates. No, the impact of all of the macrophytes, the plants growing in the river, is to reduce the amount of oxygen in the waterways, and the combination of oxygen and temperature were key stresses for macroinvertebrates. So dissolved oxygen is driving some of that prioritising of catchments. The next one is around nutrient concentrations and loads. So we've used both modelled and actual data to assign priority in relation to this particular attribute. Concentrations are relevant where there's a risk of algal growth in some of the tributary catchments, but we're also concerned about the combined load to the estuary. So we've got some maps that indicate where loads are a high priority. Stormwater is a key stressor in relation particularly to the Karamu and the Ahuriri estuary. So they are also a key priority area for management. And the last stressor that has just been introduced fairly recently through the joint working group is looking at source protection zones as a key priority area, and that's in relation to managing the risk to community water supplies. So that has led to maps like this. So red is the worst. So those are our priority catchments for concentrations and for yield or load to the estuary. Concentrations are high in Karamu, but it's actually their yield to the estuary that is relevant in terms of their prioritising. And there are a few tributary catchments that have higher than desirable nutrient concentrations. So there's actually quite a bit of the catchment that doesn't have a nitrogen issue in terms of concentrations in the fresh water. But some of the tributary catchments that include the Marae Kākaho and the Mangaoni and the Ohiwea, I think, catchments that are locally important for managing nutrients.
Sorry, again, where's Ahuriri in there? Is that, again, that come back down to there's only one testing point?
No, because, did we model it? We didn't model it. No,
because it's,
no.
I thought the A in tank was for the Ahuriri estuary, and every time you're putting something up, there's nothing, it's not on the map, it's not on the list, I'm getting quite confused by that.
it's analysts that we have to use as a verb, spell tank. The main tributary to the Aorere catchment is the Taipo. That's the one that we measure. And there are lots of smaller ones that Anna has tested for just tiny tributaries, and that is the problem because it's mainly really the estuary. So we've got a long-term perspective of the biggest tributary, and I don't know what the proportion is, but most of it comes through the Taipo, and this is the one site that we measure. But because it's an estuary, we have other values that we manage for. We manage for the estuary values because here we look at algal growth in the big tributaries of the Narara and Tutakuri and the Karamo. So it's another system. That's the problem with the Aorere. This is why, because that Aorere work as being an estuary has to catch up with everything, and that was Anna starting with its sampling and getting more detail around the estuary. This is why I haven't included it here with the set of values that we're talking about right now.
Well, just ask a simple question. I've taken from your map there, when you've got the priority case for nitrogen concentrations, the areas where there are issues with nitrogen you put on the map, and I by assumption assumed that with Ahuriri there isn't a particularly big problem with nitrogen concentrations. Is that correctly interpreting that?
No, it is. No,
Not exactly.
No, it's got red lights all over the place. Oh, well. That's what, because that's how it reads to me.
Can I go back from your full page?
So if there was a nitrogen problem in the Ahuriri, it should be red up there, shouldn't it?
It should be.
But it's not on there. I took it there wasn't really.
I don't know why you excluded it.
No,
It would be.
Speak to the microphone. Folks, can we just try and bring some resolution to this question?
This is your report. Yeah.
Thanks, Gary.
You know, I'll be continuing to ask that question because we've been through 6 years of this process, as we've been told over and over again. And the Ahuriri is a catchment which is dear to me because it's in Napier, right? And every time we look up there, we go, there's nothing there.
So you're going to get some separate information and presentation on Ahuriri, as I understand it. There are a bespoke set of issues around the management of that estuary because of where it is, and particularly because of the stormwater concentrations, etc. So that will be dealt with separately.
Okay, that's fine. I'll wait for that. Yeah, then, that's fine.
And maybe just to add on that, why it's not on this map. This map is mainly from modelled data, and the model could not deal with the Aorere catchment because it's an estuary and it's some stormwater, and it wasn't included in the model. So this is why it isn't on this map. On my state of the environment maps, it's on there. It's just that for this one, in the model context, that wasn't. I couldn't colour that in because I didn't have the flow data from the source model.
Yep. Okay, that's fine. I'm beginning to come to an understanding there. That's fine.
You can't play with one.
We have got it as a priority catchment for sediment loss in terms of its contribution to the Ahuriri estuary. With the Tutaikuri catchments.
But if we just back it up a bit, just to answer the question that was raised here, even though if you go back to the previous map, even though the red for nitrogen concentrations and yield don't extend to the Ahuriri estuary, what you're saying though is actually it would, if it were coloured, it would likely be red as well because all of that's contributing in there. Is that
I'm not
right?
sure that it's red, and we have to check with Anna.
My question around that, the water flows, kiutakitai, and as it gets depleted down there, would that be a contributing factor to the high density of the red, and even into the estuary? If you don't have a good water flow, from its source, from the mountains to the sea, and it's slowly still, well, that's, still water becomes contaminated. So I'm just wondering what the flow's like, and how it would contribute to these stresses. even to the point of if it's just dribbling out of estuary, and you've got to realise I'm a layman in this, so I'm just trying to make some sense of it.
Jenny, I think the issue with the Ahuriri catchment is it's a short-run catchment, and that led to the issues around the modelling. What this map is actually of land use, it's not of where there is high nitrogen in stream, which is to say there's been a modelling exercise to identify what are the land uses that are contributing high levels of nitrogen into those catchments. And given it's a small short-run catchment, it doesn't fit into this framework. So this is not about where there's high nitrogen in stream per se, it's about where have we got the areas of land use in the tank catchments that need to be managed for nitrogen. That's not to say there isn't high levels of nitrogen in the going into the Ahuriri estuary. We just don't have large areas of land use that are driving that. Although, having said that, the requirements to have farm environment management plans and everything that sits in those parts of the management framework will apply in the Ahuriri catchments as well. So the farms will have nutrient budgeting and a bunch of things going on to manage those loads in the Ahuriri catchment. It just hasn't been part of the modelling
So I
exercise.
thought that was the in-stream. So I thought that was about the water. Those colourings.
I just have a question just to follow up of James, because I'm interested in that. So, do we have an understanding of who uses the most nitrogen, what crop uses the most nitrogen? Because a lot of that's in Heratonga, of course. So we don't have a lot of dairy farms. So do we know, because if it gets down to there's too much nitrogen, are there crops that we don't want grown on the plains?
We did do some modelling, and that was part of the economic analysis for working out the mitigation costs. And so the model that we used was a SPASMO model that looked at both water and land use and was able to predict M losses per hectare. And yes, we do have that for various crops, and some are worse than others in terms of the amount that they lose. But it also is really dependent on where they are in the catchment. So different soils will have different impacts on what your net losses are.
That's absolutely true, because there's such a variation of soils. That point is very. But so the amount of nitrogen they put on depends on the quality of the soil, doesn't it? So, because we're going to have to get down to that level eventually, aren't we? We're going to have to understand this cocky here is putting on this much nitrogen, bags and bags and bags of it. I mean, like dairy farmers run them by truckloads. So, we've got to understand who's putting on the nitrogen to cause this effect.
Yes, in a word. It's how we do that and who we apply the regulations to and the order in which we do it in order to get the outcomes that we're looking for. So it's not that one-size-fits-all approach that we're building here.
Because if he's got light soil, he puts on, and he grows a heavy nitrogen crop, he's putting on a lot of nitrogen.
One of the new problems that we identified was the effect of soil type and land drainage activities. And we did some surveying of what was coming out of that drainage water, and it did have quite high levels of nutrients and even sediment and phosphorus as well, which was quite a surprise. But I guess it reflected what was happening in terms of the land drainage activity, that it was shortcutting a lot of the interaction with the water coming through the soil profile and going straight into the receiving environment. We don't have a mitigation measure for that, but that is something that the landowners now know is a problem, and as part of the implementation plan is looking at ways of improving our land drainage activities to reduce the losses going through that particular pathway.
But it is accurate to say, is it not, that this plan does not take an approach of directing land use. It does not create a hierarchy of worse to better, as it may be, land uses in terms of what nutrient problems they create. So that approach was a deliberately avoided approach in this in this plan. So other than there being water quality standards that have to be met, and an individual property owner, grower, would have to meet that standard somehow.
He can do what he wants, as long as he doesn't pollute.
There's no directive as to how to do that.
Okay, no, I
land
get
use
that.
wise.
Yep.
So if the outcome of someone's activity is high nitrogen loss,
Yes, I think so.
the resource management says that it's everyone's responsibility to mitigate, avoid, and all that kind of stuff. So how are we managing that in terms of ensuring people mitigate? And what, in terms of their farm plans, do we ask them to have some different filtration systems or whatever that goes into their waterways? What do we have in place for that?
So we'll cover that the next slide virtually.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Right. This is
Going, Mr. Chairman.
the priority catchments for sediment loss, which includes the Ahuriri because they feature quite highly in terms of sediment loss risk. We are still developing a map around dissolved oxygen, but that will mostly be the Karamu catchments where all the macrophytes are. And since Sandy's still here, I was going to make her talk to this slide as well. It's something she created for the tank group to explain how complicated natural ecosystems are. And that, yeah.
It all started basically looking at the Karamu catchment and that the macroinvertebrate index was so particularly low compared to anything else in Hawke's Bay. And just wondering, what is the main stressor? What is it that causes the MCI to be so particularly low in the Karamu catchment? And because we already saw it's a different system, as being a lowland system with macrophytes, than what we usually have with gravels and algae, we investigated all potential stressors, or not all, but as many as we could at the same time, looked at 16 different sites of the same type of streams and measured the MCI and all the stresses at the same time and looked at the statistical way to look at what is actually the main impact on our macroinvertebrates, what is the main stresses that we have. And so we could identify that actually the dissolved oxygen and the temperature are kind of the ones that let all sensitive animals drop out. But also the problem is that everything is dependent on each other. So macrophytes affect oxygen, but nutrients have an effect on macrophytes as well. And we've got sediment accumulating that let aquatic plants grow, but on the other hand, as soon as they establish, they collect even more sediment. And all of these things interact with each other. But the question was, what are the key factors that we could tackle and that we could change in order to get the system to a healthier state? And the key factors were temperature and dissolved oxygen, which brings us back to riparian management and not focusing solely on nutrients, because that would bring us nowhere in the Karamu catchment. So the main thing is really starting to reduce macrophyte growth to a healthy level, and then dissolved oxygen gets better together with the flow and the temperature. So that these are the things that we have to look at differently in the Karamu catchment as opposed to the other ones.
Sandy, I have a question around that. It's a particular interest of mine. Did the tank process discuss how we manage the contradiction that we have within the regional council with riparian planting and flood control?
Yes, so this is actually what we are very actively working on now. What we have is a model that first of all tells us how to most efficiently shade. What do we need in terms of plant height and closeness to the stream to shade, actually to get 70% shade? That is one thing. And then we get it together with the information from the engineers telling us what is the flood capacity that we need in order to have a proper flood management to secure, not to compromise the flood conveyance. And that tells us how tight can we plant and adjust kind of the plant types that we can plant for shade. So that's a bit of a complex thing, and we're just trying to overlay that now to get the information together. How close can we plant, what type of plants can we plant without compromising the flood conveyance, but getting enough shade to get to 70%, which
It's
reduces
vital
the-
to our success that we solve that conundrum. It's vital.
Yes, yeah.
So there's a couple of slides that we will revisit that issue.
I'm interested in the same question, because we have, in my view, for too long, had the engineers who determine what the shape of the river should be. Just look at the Karamu around Havelock North. Look at it, it's just all an engineering design. It's just, apart from being, in my view, ugly, the engineers won. But what we now have to have is the environmentalists.
Paku.
Right, environmentalists who say, well, rivers always had shade on them, and the shade, and if we have the floodway, it's a consequence of nature. So who's going to win the argument? Comes down to context.
Well, we need to compromise. We need a deal.
It is. It's not really winning an argument. It's finding the common grounds and finding the common solutions. So one of it is we don't necessarily have to plant 20-meter high trees on both sides of the stream. So if the engineers can get in from one side and we can shade enough from one side, that's fine, that's a compromise. Or, just this is what we are working at right now to say, how can we plant it? It's kind of learning from each other. What do the engineers need and what do the ecologists need? And that is a guy that comes out spatially as well, saying, okay, this is how we can plant in this reach or this stream, allow still for flood conveyance, but then cast enough shade. So that is a long-term thing anyway, because planting, it just takes a while for the plants to grow mature. So we have to say we've got to plant higher maybe on one side, still to allow maintenance and flow conveyance and everything else on the other. So these are kind of the solution that we're trying to find.
Well, I hope we're going to have kumbaya at the end of this, where everybody's agreed on all the solutions, but I can't see it.
So, Councillor, I think
There's definitely a solution, Rick.
there is common ground, but look,
We haven't got it
duty
yet.
bound to remind the committee that the previous approach to drainage was essentially done at lowest cost. So the world we're moving into will require more investment, it will require more complex management practice, and so while we can find the common ground, it's going to be more expensive to achieve a fuller range of community outcomes, and that's just something the community needs to accept if it wants to have its cake and eat it too, in terms of drainage but also high ecological function. And that's why, of course, in the long-term plan, the council is investing considerably more to achieve those more rounded outcomes.
And I guess just to add to that, though, you have to weigh that up to the cost to the ecology of having the former practice.
Yeah.
And that's the conundrum I always come back to, is because we haven't put a dollar value on it, it doesn't seem to get the same measure of importance. We're now understanding the importance quite late in the piece.
Very fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just to clarify Tony's point, it's not just the dollar value. A lot of the flood control in the Karamu is protecting property in Hastings. So that's the issue, that it's been designed over the last 100 years, and so it's going to be expensive to change, but we have to change it, otherwise we will never achieve the objectives of keeping the stream cool. But the deal hasn't been done yet on how we balance that act. But we can't. We're going to get a big flood. There's no doubt about that. And we can't have all of Hastings flooded out. So we do have to have a compromise here that's going to work. I want my stream planted up.
So the next, after having identified where we need to do the work, we're also looking at what we know makes a difference. And we're focusing on key mitigation practices in 3 different ways. Through identifying activities where we know the general outcomes, so milestones in relation to specific things that we need to see being done. Through farm plans, where we know the activity is more location specific. So it's in relation to where the farm is, what kind of activity the farm's carrying out, what kind of problems are being created in the place where that farm is. And finally, through rules. So where we can specify clear and certain performance standards in relation to activities that we know are risky, then they are also included in the plan change. So in terms of milestones, across the whole catchment, we are looking at improved riparian land management. So we're recognising the range of values and functions that are provided by good riparian land management, and managing also the macrophyte growth in the lowland streams through riparian land management. We have milestones in relation to wetlands, which we touched on before. So again, recognising the wide range of values that wetlands have rather than a very small focus on just biodiversity values. So we have objectives for protection and creation. We're also looking at priority management through farm plans. So that's looking at a property scale, focusing on mitigation measures that are relevant to the contaminant loss risks at the farm scale, and focusing in terms of the farm plan requirements through soil conservation and erosion control, because we know it works. I mean, we've got a long history of information and effort in this space, and it's just more of the same. And also informed by things like SEDNet, which helps us identify where the key risk areas are. Nutrient management is also identified as important at a farm plan scale, particularly if you're in one of the priority catchments for either loads or concentration. The farm plan needs to go through a critical source area identification. What's happening on that farm? Where are the contaminants going? And how can they be managed? Particular contaminant discharges, so what's happening on that particular farm? Where are the contaminants coming from? Is it things like offal pits or silage pits or effluent, those sorts of things? They have to be managed. Riparian planting, that needs to be part of the farm plan, looking at sensitive environments, which includes streams and wetlands, and identifying wetlands as well. So there's quite a big list of requirements that are identified or specified in the schedule in the plan in relation to what farm plans have to do.
Marianne, can I just ask a question on wetlands? So we've had such a huge success with peka, and when Tank has looked at the Taramu, have they targeted any particular areas where we would be a wetland could be placed? Like, is there wetland areas where we could target new wetlands?
232 St George's Road.
I would love one.
We haven't got a list of places, and that's more part of the implementation plan where the council works with its own land holdings as well as with landowners.
There's no obvious places that there's nothing obvious.
Not that we've got in the plan, no.
There is a conversation with the District Council about an area in Whakatū that's an industrial site that has some potential. The District Council's got its own ideas, and I think the priority will be to work with the Hastings District Council as well as with the Napier City Council around their stormwater network and strategically placing them at the intersection really between the streams in our network and the edge of their networks, and balancing the ability to get water off the land quickly with filtration.
Marianne, just in terms of nutrient management, you've got there that it's targeted in priority catchments. For those catchments that are okay, is there, I assume there's management of them to prevent those catchments going bad?
And it's in terms of how much effort we put in the areas where we need to do work and the preparation of farm plans in the longer term. And certainly the primary industries are recognising the need for farm plans as general good farm practice. So that's kind of underlying the regulatory push towards farm plans. And in terms of the council's effort and the regulatory approach, it's priority based. And we've got an overall objective or overall outcome that all farms have farm plans, and that will deal with the where it's okay. We've also, on top of that, got some debate around land use change. How do you manage land use change, which is still a live conversation because of the complexities around, well, what is land use change and what does it mean in the situation where the change is occurring.
So what's the rollout for farm plans across everywhere?
We've got a 10-year time frame that we've specified high, medium and low priority for. So first 3 years, high priority catchments, and so on as we get through to the end of the 10-year program.
So what's the driver for farmers to, of their own volition, change their practices ahead of being required to do it? What's the incentive for them to do that?
I guess the incentive is that they have some leadership and control if they do it earlier, and it's actually being in evidence as we speak, and that through the conversations with particularly the farmer reference group, these are the problems we've told them, and their response is, well, don't tell us what to do, just tell us what it is you want. So that's really been the nature of the conversation, that the problem for some catchments is sediment. Well, let us work out how to reduce the sediment loads in relation to the objectives and the timeframes that are set in the plan change. And if they're not, and we've got several catchment groups that are already setting up in relation to that challenge. And we will need some rules as we come along towards the end of the process that require people to have farm plans or be part of initiatives. So that's where the incentive is, I guess. You do it because you need to and you can see it as necessary, or we put a regulation in place and make you do it.
Just to add to that, looking at it through the other end of the telescope rather than what is the incentive, isn't it a better question for us to pose what is the motivation? What motivates people to do the right thing? Mm-hmm. And it's what is being a good citizen. This is what we do here. So setting sort of the agreed, collective community standards so people aspire to do it rather than forced to do it or pushed to do it.
And that was a key learning, I suppose, that landowners don't want to do the wrong thing. Most of our landowners are law-abiding citizens. We just haven't set the right laws in place in order for them to meet the water quality objectives, which is really hard because it's a cumulative impact of a whole lot of people behaving in a certain way. But this structure, and I'll come on to the collective management, enables farmers to understand what the problem is so that they can then deal with the problem, rather than the council saying, you'll only put X kilograms of nitrogen on. See, that doesn't solve the problem, it just tells them about the nitrogen they're putting on. The problem is that there is high levels of nutrient in the river. We haven't given them the information that enables them to make decisions around that accurately and efficiently. And using property allowances for nutrients doesn't necessarily result in the outcome that you're looking for, which is better water quality. And so it was a very complex conversation to have, particularly around nutrients, not so much around sediment, because we know what addresses sediment risk. We've done it for decades. We know about soil conservation, erosion control. We didn't know a lot about how you manage the dispersed impact of nitrogen losses across a whole range of different land use activities. And there are some that are worse than others, and dairying's always had a really bad rap, but actually growing vegetables has got quite a big environmental impact when you're looking at the effect of nutrient and contaminant losses from those vegetable areas.
I guess I agree with Rick. I mean, laws are like the stick, not the carrot. And I am just wondering, around non-priority catchments, how do we prevent them slipping backwards?
What would make them slip backwards is the question you need to ask. What are the kinds of things that would impact on what's happening? So some of them in relation to activities. What are the risk activities that we need to manage? And the other is, well, what is land use change? Sometimes it's really obvious. You go from pastoral farming to dairy farming, but sometimes it's not obvious because there's a lot of change within farm systems. So you go from sheep and beef to beef and sheep. Well, where is the change and how do we regulate that? And that is one of the outstanding issues still in the plan changes. Just how do you get someone in the door so that the council can keep track of that change? And you'll get some more reporting on that and hopefully a solution alongside the different primary industries that have a really big interest in how we manage this kind of land use effect.
So I guess that picking up on what we were talking about before around communication and trying to understand how we manage the whole environment for better outcomes across the board, and that's not just fixing up the hot spots that are particularly bad, but people wanting to be assured that we're managing the environment across the board in a better way so that we don't get more hot spots popping up.
Yeah.
And if it's not being done through the plan, then it would be good to be able to explain how we expect that's going to happen. If we're not actively managing it, what are the other activities that we're doing to ensure, you know, that farmers or whoever are understanding the impacts that their practices have on the environment and therefore are willing to and want to manage that themselves?
And the conversation is more than just about the council with the landowner, it's with the industries as well. And there's a national conversation around, people assume good practice is being done, but in the primary industry, until fairly recently, there was an assumption that we knew what good practice was. But it was never defined. It's a concept. It's a way of farming that you're doing farm, and it's in relation to animal welfare or health and safety. There is good practice. Well, what was good practice was part of what ECAN went through, Environment Canterbury, with their plan change, and there was a bit of a sea change, I think, nationally amongst the primary industries, that it's actually critical for the industries also to say, well, what is good industry practice? And some industries have been faster in this space than others, and horticulture New Zealand is one of those. They've had a good industry practice program for quite some time that tried to articulate what for them was good practice. It didn't cover all of the issues. There was still a gap in relation to nutrient management, but they're trying to fill that now. What does good industry practice for horticulture look like in relation to nutrient management? We've seen a lot of work in the dairy industry. What does good practice look like for dairy farmers? So you get the sustainable milk programs that are being run within the dairy industry. Huge improvement in understanding about, well, what is general good practice? The dairy industry, they're way right in that space. So the grape growers, they have sustainable wine programs. It's all about understanding what is good industry practice. Some of those programs have got gaps in that need to be filled, and that is part of the conversation that we have through the industry program approach in the plan change. So that work is actually relevant at a higher level than what we're looking at in Tank. And so you've got the likes of Beef and Lamb and Fonterra and Sustainable Wine all working with their individual growers to make sure that that good practice is understood and being applied. So that is happening anyway, and we will eventually catch up with that through the requirement in the plan that everybody has a farm plan. That's kind of the bottom line. In some places, good practice isn't enough. And that's where the challenge is through this plan change, to say, well, you might be all doing good practice, but it's not enough. You have to do more. And the primary industry was up for that challenge. It was like, tell us what the problem is, and we'll find a way of meeting your objectives. It is a bit of a challenge in terms of the, I guess, the trust that has been built through the Tank plan change, but it's also evident through the implementation plan and the ongoing commitment from all of those stakeholder groups to make this work, because it does need their commitment to make it work, because it won't work without them.
If I could comment on that, the dynamic of the group was such that, in fact, we had probably the most progressive growers, farmer types in the group who were pretty effective at reassuring the environmental side, if you will, side of the table, that they had the right values, that they had the right motivations and intentions, and that they were on a trajectory of improving practice, and that that the plan, therefore, didn't need to be more, I'll use the word directive in certain ways. And I think that's part of the fruits of the process that went on here. Now, so you have people like Peter Kay and some of these other guys who are sitting in this group who are kind of now on the line saying, you know, trust us. We can put together catchment groups. We can do this. We can do that. We can look at our sector programs in beef and lamb and so forth that are coming down the pike here that sound great on paper. And that's the right framework. That's the framework that we're all comfortable working within. And I'd have to say the Forest and Birds and Fish and Games of the process have said with certain wariness, we're okay with that. We're okay with that approach, and that's where the balance has been struck, so to speak. So at the end of the day, there will be targets, there will be farm plans or collective plans that do set out what people have to meet, but it's been left very open. The how has been left open. And, you know, one could argue that is one of the fruits of this process, is that otherwise you would have had one side coming in saying you must stipulate everything down to the last detail here, and the other side saying no, that, you know, we don't want any of that. So it is a risk, if you will. You know, in the framework that has been set up here, the folks who are users of the resource are going to have to deliver at the end of the day. And, you know, one could argue you have to look at the plan as, are there enough fail-safes in the plan if we don't see that progress happening, that we can intervene.
Would it be fair to say that the level of flexibility has been designed into the entire draft plan going forward to allow for the implementation of the plan?
It's flexibility on the how, not so much on, there are really quite strict expectations around farm plans and what need to be addressed and the reporting of them, the auditing of them, and also a commitment to ongoing implementation, because that collaborative feeling and commitment didn't end with the plan change. There was a real desire and people putting their hands up for saying, well, we want to be part of the perhaps annual review of implementation, and really if there's no clear progress being made, the plan is not successful. So it's kind of driving that commitment to be part of it and to keep the change going. So if that doesn't happen, you've got clear evidence that this framework isn't working, but the commitment was there to make it work.
And it will come down to the monitoring, won't it?
Yes, and the outcomes, because one of the things that we kind of realised was that it took a long time to get this bad. It's going to take a wee while to get it right, and let's focus on the things that make the difference to start that journey, to see that evidence. Yeah.
Will there be incentives to farmers who might want to surrender tracts of their land for wetlands and that kind of stuff, in terms of rates?
It was, and I can't remember where it was put, but one of the, I think it was in the wetland one, there are incentives and mechanisms that the council can use. So if there was a need for a resource consent, for example, to build a wetland, let's give the council some ability to waive consent fees, for example. So those sorts of things may well be useful tools. Yeah.
Because, I mean, all farmers have to pay rates and they've got to generate income from their land. So if they surrender their lands, there should be some compensation. I know there's Kiwi too, there's some rules. Ngā whenua rāhui, but you know, a rate remission thing would be good.
I just want to, I know, James, you're leaning forward, but can I just, a quick word, just follow up on Tom's point, because I think it's unintended consequence of the tank process, really, that the momentum is getting built up, and of the planting programs. I mean, I went to quite a few of the planting sessions, and this was on the Karamu, there were farmers there who came up to me and said, how do I do this on my block? So I've got 2 cards on my desk, which I've taped to my desk because they can't do it this year, and they, you know, when people are desperate to do their land and they're, you know, together a kilometre, So we got a lot of goodwill out of people looking at their neighbour doing it and looking at the tank saying, how do I get involved? I guess the point that Tali's alluding to, if you have in the middle of all that a chap that doesn't want to do it, that's when we're going to bring the stick down. So, but at the moment we have such phenomenal momentum, we haven't got enough plants. That's our problem at the moment.
A couple more before lunch, possibly. The other area of priority management was around new rules. So there is a bunch of new regulation being introduced by the plan change. The stock exclusion, that was going to come anyway, whether it came through the council or national regulation. But one of the cool things that the Farmer Reference Group, and Councillor Belford mentioned the people around the tank table, but it's kind of growing that there is actually a Farmer Reference Group that is also doing work as a consequence of the conversations. And they were asked about stock exclusion and targets for excluding. And normally you would say by a certain time after the operative date of the plan. We don't exactly know when the operative date is because you never know how many appeals and other drama might happen through the Schedule 1 process. But the farmers themselves said, oh no, just put 2023, we can get it done by 2023. So it's actually a commitment in the plan that stock exclusion in the lower hill country is achieved by 2023. There are rules around cultivation that weren't previously there. So we're saying you don't cultivate right up to the stream. I mean, that is a risk activity. There are numbers now that we can enforce compliance with those sorts of things quite easily. And cultivation on hill slopes. It's not good practice to get up onto those really steep slopes and spray and pray, I think, was the phrase that some of the reference group talked about. Managing land use change is still a bit of a tricky conversation. It's not that there is opposition to the need for it, it's just how you effectively introduce regulation around it is the problem at the moment. New rules and policies around stormwater that Rena will talk to you about later. Drainage discharges, so just to motivate attention to that drainage impact, there are new water quality outcomes that we're looking for. So there are some new provisions in the drainage rules and new provisions around drinking water protection as well to protect our communities. So those are the rules. Why is it not going? Oh, now I've gone too far. Bugger. Read it from there. So the specification around farm plans is not quite the same as tuki because it's a little bit more targeted. So it doesn't mean everyone has to do everything. It means that everyone has to look at their own property and look for what are the problems on your property and what is the problem in the catchment to which you belong. And this came from also the primary industry groups is, well, what about opportunities to work across boundaries? So where are opportunities for us to work together as a collective to meet the outcomes in our catchment? So that was quite a key provision in the plan that builds community expertise, resilience, and ability in terms of meeting the outcomes that we've got. It also is actually really good for council because it means we can deal with groups of people in a catchment rather than individual farmers. It's more effective and efficient in meeting the outcomes that we're looking for. So it's built on that property scale assessment, but it enables the solutions to be built at a more catchment scale. And it's outcomes focused. What's the problem for that catchment? So it might be clarity or sediment deposition, or it might be nutrient loads or concentrations. It might be macrophytes. So it enables the solutions to be built within that catchment or within that property. And so we're looking for innovation, we're looking for flexibility, which is the really cool part of this plan change. It says something has to be done, but it enables the outcomes to be flexible and innovative according to what the problem is. And some of the other things that were also identified as features of the collective approach was that Well, it might not just be water quality they're dealing with, it might be biodiversity, it might be pest control, or it might enable farmers to work collectively for production purposes as well as for environmental purposes, which is actually what we're seeing currently with beef and lamb, supporting, I think they call themselves action networks, groups of farmers that are encouraged to work together to meet production outcomes, and using those groups of farmers to also consider environmental outcomes. And we've got a group of farmers working up the Marae Kākaho doing exactly that, and they had their first meeting just recently. So it's looking at opportunities to use limited resources effectively across a range of issues that farmers face. And it means that farmers are supported. It's not the council coming on with another bit of compliance. So it's enabling them to do their job properly and giving them the tools they need and the information they need to meet the outcomes that the community have imposed. That's the farm plans. So the content of either the farm plan, if people want to work individually, or the collective, is specified in schedules in the plan. And there are quite a few requirements around how groups operate and the kinds of information they need to collect, and to also report to the council so that we can say this system is working, farmers are doing what it is they said they were going to do in the order they said they were going to do it. So there are time frames that need to be specified in the plans as well, and they're linked back to the time frames that are in the plan. So there are certain dates and outcomes that we're looking for. They need council approval, and there are also auditing requirements so that we can make sure that people are doing a good job.
And I guess it's worth noting we're not just assuming that this is going to happen spontaneously. There are folks out there, farmers who want to make it happen and are taking the initiative, as Marianne says, but we've also made a significant investment in our long-term plan in terms of beefing up the land management team internally at the council that is going to be charged with communicating this and helping drive it forward.
You've got how much longer to go, Marianne? 2 more sites? Is it? Or many more?
From my understanding, one of the issues we had with Plan Change 6 and the farm environmental plans was that we weren't receiving a copy of them here. Is that something that's been amended? Or
You kind of got to be careful what you wish for, because if you receive something, you've got to do something with it. So you've got to make sure that what you get is what you need and what you want. So we probably don't need the whole farm plan. We need to know, and we've specified what it is we want to know. So that's a key part of this.
Right.
So we do need to build in those requirements.
Yep.
Information management systems.
A farm environmental management plan could go beyond what we need.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we hope it would.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is we need to receive some information confirming that there is one in place and that it deals with the issues we're particularly concerned about. Yeah. That's what you're saying?
The farmers were keen to share because they've done a lot of soil conservation work over the years. Might have dropped off a bit, but that might have been because the council wasn't reminding them that it is important. If you keep reminding people it's important, it stays front of mind. But what they wanted to share, they wanted to share what they were doing because they were really feeling, they weren't feeling the love, let's put it that way, from the urban communities. So they wanted a platform that they could share what they were doing. And it might not be right now, but they wanted to share that they had a plan, as it were. So this helps that communication.
Yeah, I think again, to me, there's a lot of comms around this that could really serve useful purposes. Telling the good news stories, filling the gaps. Yeah, acknowledging people, any fits.
So some of the challenges on us to make sure we not only receive the information, but we process it and feed it out again, so it's useful. We covered the asset management and the various objectives that we had in managing our waterways didn't always align, and that there were some challenges for, that arose from historic decision making that we now have to reconsider. So there are some challenges for the council. The weed boat, actually, it was still important. We might have to do it slightly differently so that we don't leave the weeds in the water, but as an interim solution, that was still identified as being necessary. Some of the other things, and Councillor Gray mentioned before, in relation to the demands, the expectations that are being raised through the conversations that we're already having. And there are already examples of landowners doing riparian planting in the Karamu catchment, the farmers in the pastoral catchments wanting information, setting up their catchment collectives. So there's an increasing demand on the council for resources, so advice, assistance, information, funding, and we need to have a bit of a plan for the plan. We are partly addressing that through the implementation plan, which will advise also decisions that you might need to make in your annual and long-term plans, particularly in relation to funding and support. We need consistent responses to the landowners. So the ones that want to do it now, we can deal with, but we also need to know that all of the landowners that are out there have the same kind of messaging and certainty around the funding and the whatever subsidy opportunities the council puts in place. The conversations have not really assumed that there would be subsidies, but things go a hell of a lot faster if there are. And also subsidies help reflect that actually the problem isn't always at the individual scale. Sometimes the problem is because of our historic decision making, our previous decisions around things like our drainage and floodway management, for example. So there are opportunities for the council to consider just how it supports some of this work through their subsidies and funding programs. And the last big message was we make it easy and we make it simple. We reduce the administrative and bureaucratic burdens on farmers and things would go a lot more smoothly. So that was, I think, the last... there were questions around what if it doesn't make a difference, but it's what is it that you're looking for in this plan change? And we've said we know there are some key actions that will make a difference. Let's focus on getting those done. Let's make sure that we reach the milestones because we know they are going to be effective. So we've got regular monitoring and that collaborative approach to annual reviews of progress. So that would be success. If you were looking for an MCI to improve from 60 to 90 within 10 years, is so fraught with complexity and difficulty that it's actually the wrong outcome to focus on at this stage. So we're encouraging you to think about, well, what are the things that are going to make a difference? So it's that collective responsibility, it's looking at the key mitigation measures that we've identified, and it's the farm plans. So that would be success. And we've written a policy to try and allay concerns around, well, this might not work. Well, it might not work, but unless it gets some support and we keep working on it, those are the key kind of inputs into this plan change that the council need to consider.
It's a first up.
Perhaps a great note to finish on for lunch. Quite a lot to digest and all of that. I think Marianne sort of hit the nail on the head about the character and flavour of this plan change. It's about practical stuff that can be done and not trying to achieve perfection within a whole degree of scientific uncertainty, which we'd never get the job even started if we tried to definitively answer how to get MCI from 60 to 90 in 10 years in context A, B or C. So that's sort of, I think, set us up well for the afternoon and where we're heading.
But haven't you really missed the other point, philosophical point I've got out of this, is that we can make plans and issue edicts from Dalton Street. Whatever we say to the people out there, they'll say, well, those are your ideas, those are your plans. And then you become into a coercive way to get people to do it. But what's being said here has been a community group of all different walks of life, and it's now become their plan. So there's ownership here, which is different from an edict. That's the underlying message from this. And we've agreed on what the outcomes are, haven't got all the answers, but have agreed on a path and a vision and a direction. So this is the choice we have here, an edict out of Dalton Street, or we all, the community, engage on a plan, best intentions to get to the best outcomes. So I think that's what's been put in front of us today. Clear alternatives.
We can think about that at lunch.
Over lunch.
Thank you.
So perhaps if we reconvene it.
Well, you know, see the front page of the paper this morning, we're eating far too much and far too much.
No, I'm sorry.
Let's reconvene at 1:15.
Yeah, thank you.
1:15.
That's very generous. I like that. It's better